thank you for that. I've got to live up to something now. This first slide is, on the first blush, it's a little bit provocative. But if you think about it, these companies that are on the way out of our economy, the first three have had their products dematerialise. The service of mailing letters has disappeared, all but disappeared. Supermarkets have huge investments in bricks and mortar, fixed investments, and hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue is being taken away from them by new business models like My Food Bag. Sky TV, if it wasn't for the All Blacks, probably wouldn't have a business in a couple of years because their content distribution market has now gone global. There is really no model that's efficient in directories anymore, and any retailer that has got a large investment in bricks and mortar is really having to think about, what's the new model? How do I move on? I didn't want to hype technology, but I'll just draw your attention to this idea here, which comes from Singularity University, which is an initiative backed by NASA and Stanford University and so on, based in California. So these guys have just identifying technologies that are going to massively change the world. And they ask the question, why is it that the technologies we think are going to change the world have really not done anything to amaze us? And they studied the 10 technologies they think that will change the world in a massive way, and some of them, like 3D printing, have been around for over 30 years. And they discovered that every single one of these technologies obeys Moore's law, which is to say that every year they double in productivity. So why is it that 3D printing hasn't changed our lives? And their argument is that each year you can print, 0.002 widgets when the year before you could print 0.001, it doesn't really make any difference to you. But we're now at the inflection point where those numbers are now going from 10 to 20 to 40 to 80. And it now looks like that the whole concept of manufacturing is going to radically change. And these 10 technologies, they include things like driverless cars. And where I went to university in California, driverless cars are everywhere. You can buy them, and your car can drive you to work. This is now. So I would argue that we are on the precipice. If you think of change up until now, we're at the precipice of 10, 20x of that sort of change. So imagine if we take ourselves back 10 years and imagine that you're on the board of Blockbuster or Video Easy. The way we're taught to think about strategy and leadership is we sit in the boardroom and we think about our company and how can we advance the cause of the company that we have. And the problem with that is that, and you can see it in retrospect with Video Easy. For those that live here, it's a large video rental store chain, is that you can do everything you like with conventional strategy in terms of getting greater scale or differentiating on the basis of what customers want. But then iTunes comes along and just kills your entire model, right? So we're now living in a world where disruption has to come in and you have to think disruptively when you're running a company that might have been designed 10 or 20 years ago and look on the surface to be quite stable. You now have to not just increment that, but you have to think about how you might disrupt yourself. So the answer to this is innovation, and what I'm arguing is that we all have to be innovators now. If we all have to be innovators, we have to teach ourselves how to do it. And so just the definition of innovation is just a new idea that's successfully commercialized. And I think that the relationship that most Kiwi business people have to innovation is quite immature. So even if you looked at Callaghan, which is a government-funded kind of exercise to promote innovation in New Zealand, their idea of innovation is really people in white coats and in labs or people writing software. And the reality is that that's only 10% of innovation, the new idea part. The 90%, so 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration. The perspiration is the commercialization. And that is the tough part. So I work with a variety of companies. You know, in a single year I might interact with, 30 or so companies through different roles that I have. At the more involved end, I've got 2 companies in every world industries, which are growth companies growing at 50% plus. And then I've got these directorships, and at the other end we work in consulting arrangements with a wider array of companies. And so I get to see a reasonable sort of, topology of what's going on. And so today what I want to share with you is 6 things that I've identified in regular companies which can, if understood, can lead to breakthrough and lead to a more innovative and disruptive way of looking at your business. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is intention. By the way, I don't apologize. A lot of these ideas are very, very simple, but like all good things, they're tremendously profound. Most companies that we interact with actually don't really have a clear idea of where they're going. And what that looks like is this. So if you think about your company the way it is today, and then you think about it trying to add some increment of performance improvement or some addition to what you have, the problem with that is it doesn't provide you any directionality. And because you never have the sort of confidence to make big moves, you can never develop confidence, you just can't be bold. So a better way to look at directionality and intention is to visualize the future from a clean sheet of paper and do a very, very good and deep job of that. Now, if you can do that, what that allows you to do is build a sort of a mental staircase toward that future. Now, companies don't grow in straight lines, they grow in like a staircase. They make a succession of different breakthroughs. But it's very important to frame this problem, because if you look at your to-do list, and each one of you here today, have a to-do list, right? And most of you, I imagine, if you were bold enough to put your hand up, would admit that most of the things on there are urgent items, right? What you need is a list of important items, things that you've got to work on today that aren't going to give you a return to the P&L this year, but are actually going to be the foundation stone to the castle you need to build in the future. And I would say 90% of the businesses that I interact with have absolute lack of clarity. So we're going to talk about design shortly, and of course any designer that starts off on a design needs to have some sort of intention, right? The other important element of intention is that once intention has been validated by what's going on in the market, so it's in other words, it's going to fit the environment you're in, and then you gain alignment amongst your stakeholders, that forms the basis for purpose-driven leadership. And that's the model where you can go and create something new. And most of us can't do that without clarity of where we're going to go. The other, I mentioned design before, but design is just, the process of design is really just another way of thinking. And we're incredibly trapped because of our education system. Our education system was conceived in the late 1700s to get a whole lot of people who had been brought up by their families in an agricultural environment and make them obedient and literate and numerate so they could staff all the factories that were getting built as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And so you can see the legacy of that design in schools today, right? All the desks and most classrooms face toward the teacher, and there's bells and uniforms and all sort of thing. Is really just basically educating all of the initiative out of us. And the way we're taught to think is very left brain oriented, it's very logical. And most of us have lost the ability to use our right brain, to use our creative center. The right brain is an incredibly powerful part of our thinking space. It's the only part of our thinking that allows us to look at stuff holistically. Now the problem is we've got to think inside of very ambiguous and complex space. Because until now, most of the thinking you do is really just an extension or an increment on what's happened before. But of course, in a new world, when all the rules have changed and your market definition has changed, you've got to think for yourself and come up with something that doesn't exist. And that's kind of the whole point of innovation, right? If you're going to come up with something that doesn't exist, you need to go and relearn a whole lot of new thinking skills. And so the kind of thinking they teach you in school is called inductive reasoning. The kind of thinking that they teach you at McKinsey and Bain and BCG and so on is called deductive, because they can't charge $1 million for 6 weeks' work and not come up with an answer, right? So got a whole lot of smart people who've kind of done stuff before, so they think up the answer in 5 minutes and then they just set about proving it's true. That's the deductive methodology. I know there's at least one ex-McKinsey consultant in here, so he can attack me later when he speaks later on. Abductive reasoning is different. Abductive reasoning exists entirely within an ambiguity. And in ambiguity, our left brain isn't really capable of handling the thought processes, so we need to do something else. And so how many have heard of design thinking? I can see a couple of design thinkers out there. My advice to you is this is an incredibly important skill and you need to get it. My email address is on the end of this presentation. I've collected a Dropbox of amazing materials on design thinking. If you can get onto a course and teach yourselves design thinking, you should do it. But I've amassed the best treasure trove of materials possible into a Dropbox, and I'm willing to share the link with anyone here, so just email me and I'll do that. And we haven't got time here to talk about the whole process of design thinking, but what I will say is that it's collaborative. So it involves working in teams with diverse team members. And most importantly, it involves a thing called flair or divergence. So we're talking about the way you're taught to think is to converge on an answer very quickly. If someone gives you a difficult problem, the very first thing you want to do is get rid of the insecurity of the possibility you might not be able to solve it. And that forces you to converge on what you know. So it's very difficult for you and your companies to come up with unpredictable ideas. It's the flair or the divergence part of thinking that's actually critical to coming up with unpredictable results. And design thinking is a framework of thinking that allows you to do that systematically. And so I'll just reiterate my recommendation. And just by way of a simple story to illustrate this is a Stanford D-School project, and the design intention was to make a cheaper incubator on the basis that incubators cost $20,000 and there's a lot of infant mortality in rural India. So if we had a cheaper incubator, we could have less infant mortality, right? So if we just go back here, at the bottom you see the beginning part of design thinking is to flare out. And what that is going out and gaining some empathy with the problem. So the students in this example, they go to India and they look in the hospital and there's 2 incubators in the hospital and no babies in there. So why is there no babies in there? Well, there's no babies in there because the mothers are all poor and they live in rural areas and they've got no transport, right? So it doesn't matter how cheap the incubator is, does it? It's not going to solve the problem. So then they go out there and they find that the issue isn't premature babies anyway, it's just that their houses are freezing cold and the babies can't regulate their temperature in the first 4 weeks of birth. And so they reframe the problem. The problem is that poor people in India, give birth to babies and can't regulate their temperature in the first 4 weeks, and they create this little $50 sleeping bag, and it has a massive impact on mortality, right? The point I want to take away from this, I'll just go back. The point I want to take away from this is that in design thinking, you don't actually nail down the problem you're going to solve until you get past that first diamond. And so half of the process is really just figuring out what problem you're going to solve. And the problem you solve is almost never the one you think you're going to solve up front. And then, of course, flaring out again is about ideating all the different ideas and then prototyping and repeating and so on, because we have no analytical process to work through disruption. The basic design framework is that, and this is kind of an axiomatic model, is that if something is desirable for users, whoever the users you choose are, and it's viable, in other words, you can make money out of it, and it's feasible, you've got the technology and ability to build it, then it will be great. So if you think of this in a business context, if we can create a business that is desirable for all the users, and not just customers, but everybody, suppliers and the rest of it, because we're all just voluntarily in this ecosystem, if we can have it make money, so a productive business model that doesn't absorb lots of cash when it grows and so on, doesn't need huge amounts of capital, and it's feasible, in other words, we've got the technology. Now what's going on at the moment, of course, is that circle, feasibility, is getting so much larger that the amount of optimal business models that haven't been discovered has never been greater, right? And why is feasibility getting larger? Because of the technology of high bandwidth communications and computing and all these other things that have come along have made the feasibility of different business models go from infeasible to feasible. And this has happened all around you. So your businesses were designed before that feasibility circle shifted in size. And this is your problem. The third thing is an incredibly simple idea, and it's just the idea of being curious. And Wayne Gretzky has a really good quote, why was he the best ice hockey player in the world? And the reason, he says, is that the other players skate to where the puck is and I skate to where the puck's going to be. Now, if you want to figure out where the puck's going to be, you better start getting curious, because there's a lot of stuff that we don't know, but we don't know. And that's the scary part. And that part of the circle has gotten bigger than ever. So the reason I want to talk about curiosity is that innovation, the wellspring of innovation is insight. Insight is something that you don't currently know, which is very surprising and gives you a different perspective on a problem. So very quickly, some simple things that have come as examples of insight. So listening to people. There's a part of design thinking called empathy. It's not market research. It's just empathy. So these kitchen tools here are a $1 billion business, and those came from watching arthritic people trying to zest lemons. Because if you've got arthritis and you're holding a kitchen tool and there's lemon juice all over your hands, it's incredibly hard to do. And how they solved the problem was put these giant rubber handles on. And that turns out that giant rubber handles are incredibly useful for people who aren't arthritic. But you don't get that insight until you actually go and start tinkering with things and empathizing with people and being a human. And so you can liberate a lot of insight from that. At Spring, we have a methodology called value chain mapping, which I think is very interesting. And I often ask people, I say, what was the biggest building? So in a city, the biggest building is typically a company owns it who has the most economic power, right? It's the sort of a shortcut. So in 1910, NRM, Northern Roller Mills, had a big building on Fort Street, right? And because in those days, there was a lot of power in flour. There is no power in flour anymore. Why? Because transportation infrastructure got better, so now it was just easier to bake the bread, and now you got power in bread. And of course, these days, everybody's milked all the possible power they can get out of that, and preservatives are better and all the rest of it. So then the power went to the supermarkets, and now the supermarkets are losing it to someone else. So what's generally happening in the value chain is that the power is moving away from product and service, and it's moving into systems and solutions. And the reason for that is because the marginal cost of information is zero. So where information is the lubricant that's allowing us to deliver models which provide end solutions, because it literally costs us zero to get perfect information. So I just raised that because it's just a very insightful framework. So we use it to identify vacuum in the value chain. So there are 12 generic value chains in the economy, and we can find where existing business models have a lot of economic power, but we can theorize about where the economic power needs to grow. And then we don't look at businesses, we just look at assets. So customer bases, data, resources, technologies, and we say what kind of company needs to be created in the value chain to gain economic power. And then you can say, well, we need to buy these 4 assets or whatever. So we sometimes work with private equity companies thinking about how we can create investment ideas for private equity out of understanding migration in the value chain. This is a model which has come out of software as a service. And so software as a service is very efficient to fund, right? Because if you look at Xero, it's worth billions, but it hasn't made a profit. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because of this cost of acquisition versus lifetime value model. So if you can acquire customers for less than a third of their lifetime value, then it's an infinite investment machine, isn't it? Because you just keep investing and growing those customers, and you can raise capital at very high valuations for that if you can prove that model. Now, we couldn't prove it before, so there were a few companies, 40 years ago you could run a company doing catalogs or whatever, is very similar, and they had reasonably good data on this. But these days you can run this with perfect data. So it means that your funnel, the suspects, qualified leads, and so on, you've got literally a completely quantitative funnel that you can manage. And so you don't need to theorize about how you would take that to market. You literally just look at the numbers and try 100 things and just concentrate on the 2 that work. This is an amazing model. Now, we're applying this model now to businesses that are not just software. So retail, this is a great model for, right? Because you can't actually make a return on a retail site anymore because the property's worth too much. But what you can do is acquire customers to your brand on there, but justify it on this cost of acquisition lifetime value model. And I could literally talk to you for an hour on this topic. So about 2 years ago, I realized that all the companies I'm involved in are literally stopped in IT. I mean, hands up here if IT is stopping you doing stuff right now. I mean, I would think the whole room, if they were motivated enough, would put up their hand. Because seriously, we've got a IT crisis. And the reason is that we've got a whole lot of vendors out there like Oracle and IBM and Microsoft foisting 20-plus-year-old technology onto us at vast costs to prop up their profitability. Now, the honest truth of it, after I did my 3 months of work and talking to people and quirky developers and so on, the honest truth of this is that you're being ripped off and you're not getting anything valuable for your money. Now, we are going to need a level of agility in information technology that is way beyond. We have to go to the level of agility that you can get in Silicon Valley companies. Now, these guys are not using vendor-provided software. They are all open source. And all the good developers in the world are developing in open source now because we have a global community that is sharing ideas and contributing leading-edge technology for free all over the world, right? So if you can build knowledge, and as a manager, I think you need personal knowledge of how this works, because the vendors won't help you. In fact, a lot of the vendors are clueless themselves. They avoid talking about this in their own conferences. You need to build a bunch of private clients, which is your own software to bake your competitive advantage into your own software. Your own software helps moderate the behavior of your users. And you need to go out and use all the cloud software that, avail yourself of the tens of thousands of use cases that are being put into cloud software right now. The only way you can use that is if you can use a thing called an API, and the only way you can get all the right data from all the rest of your company into these apps is through an API, and you need to do that off your own data stack. And the only way you can build that at the moment is to build it yourself. Now, we've got companies that, a clean sheet of paper, 50 grand will build you a great data stack that will literally integrate all the data across your whole company. But you need to know how to do it, and that means you need to be curious. And unfortunately, I don't have more time to talk about it because I'd love to. The best company is a computer plugged into the wall. That is a very, very provocative way to think about hiring people, but we need to do it because all the models that we're currently using at the moment use a lot of humans, and most of them are not required. So if you think about all the humans working for your company, you've got builders, you've got operators. The operators mostly can be automated out of existence. Now, I know that sounds harsh, but what's worse is if the company falls over and you lose all your shares or or whatever. It's just no point. We need, more than ever, we need builders, and they're hard to find. People who can design stuff. And we can automate out a tremendous amount of our costs. So most of the companies we're working with at the moment are deliberately targeting massively lower percentages of labour cost at all levels. And we're making budgets for designers and builders and so on who are building the automation, building the technology platforms and everything that allow us to, for example, use our customers to do the work for us. You know, for example, you used to have to, or at least, you know, there's no accounts receivable in a software as a service company, is there? Just people use credit cards, right? So of course, if you have accounts receivable, there's a complete waste of money and time. Okay, you can automate that. This is today. I've got friends in Silicon Valley, fellow directors who are Silicon Valley based, who have got cars that they can dial them up on their telephone and get them to unpark themselves, come and pick them up, and then they hop in and they drive them to work and they just do emails. This is today. You can buy this car. Within 10 years, we will go from everyone owning and driving their own car to just driverless cars. The cost of getting a car to be driverless now is just hundreds of dollars. So we are at the precipice of that massive change, and you think about, you know, how many drivers there are in the economy and so on. It's just massive. So technology, you've got to integrate. The technology of the future is about integration or connection. Your legacy IT systems cannot do it. It's just a fact. You have to get off your legacy platform onto something that can connect with APIs so that you can integrate your business into the economy at no cost. Anybody does anything manually, you've got to get rid of it. You've got to collect every piece of data. So we're now getting our companies have dashboards, and we can literally measure everything. We can measure how many customers go to this physical store and buy online and how long it takes for them to do that and what things they buy online, things they don't buy online. So we can drive everything with data. We recruit our users to do work for us, like no accounts receivable. They can reconcile their own accounts because they can just see it, because they can just directly access your systems. And we focus on the entire experience, not just getting transactions. So we can build the whole experience, we can see it all digitally. I like to always talk a little bit about strategy. Most people, when you talk about strategy, they think it is a plan. And so I want to get clear about strategy, because strategic power is really important when it comes to growth. Strategy is only about competition. So it's impossible to have a strategy unless you have competition. That's the point of it. And there's really only two things you need to think about, but they seem simple, but they're not. So the first one is you need to define your market. And today, more than ever, it's very, very difficult to define your market. The second thing is once you've defined your market, you've got to be able to defend what makes you best in that market. So we're just a couple of points to illustrate that. I mean, we know what this company is. It was in the directory market, right? And then along comes Google, and it's all about search. And then search does not actually solve the problem of a directory, right? The directory, what directories do is they connect you mostly to services, okay? So it might surprise you to learn that even today, only 40% of service providers have websites. If you don't have a website, you're not going to be on search, right? And search doesn't tell you whether someone's available, how close they are by, and whether they're the right person for you, and whether that's a plumber you'd like to let into your house, whatever. It doesn't tell you that. So if we're going to have a strategy for a company like this, the first thing we've got to decide is what market we're in. And I would argue that the market network for services, and in which we can now use technology to reimagine services, right? And we can imagine it through different lenses. We can imagine it through the homeowner's lens. What are the kinds of services you need to procure for your house? How many people get their gutters cleaned once a year and they forget who provided the service last year, and then you got to look up your Outlook or something and try and find the guy, and you didn't write it down, and now you're back to square one, and you've got to go use a Google search or go to a directory again. You know, think of it, this can all be Ubered, can't it? And so it's really just a question about who's going to build it, and can I find an efficient way of funding the build? And the best positioned company to do that is, of course, this company, but it doesn't do it. And it doesn't do it because it can't think the way I'm talking about, and that's it. They got all the money, got the customer database, got everything. And there are really only 4 ways to build strategic power. You know, scale is a great one because you can leverage your fixed costs, unique IP, owning brands and customers, or owning the resources themselves. And the new resource, by the way, is data. The last one I want to talk about is governance. And for most people, that's like a board. But I keep hearing again and again, people think that if they get a board in their company, it's like they've bought themselves a boss. And it really isn't about that. Companies without boards are like this driver. They don't know where they're going, because what you don't know is so significant. So we talk about building teams of people that are T-shaped. So individuals with world-class skill sets in particular areas, and then having a diverse set of those people, but most importantly, each one of those people having true empathy with their ego in the background, so they can all communicate and present different perspectives on problems to allow new things to come out of groups. And governance and having strong boards, all my companies, they have boards full of people that scare me. They're so smart, and that's what you need. So there's some takeouts from today, and the presentation will be on the system here. And I'll leave you with my email address, which I reiterate my offer to share with you a treasure trove design thinking toolkit. Thank you. Do you want to do Q&A?
Yes. Have any of you got questions for Stefan? Here at the front.
How are you motivating very busy execs, GMs, management teams who are so hung up in the day about being blindsided? Being blindsided by the fact that they're not innovating.
Yeah, look, we've got a number of issues there. One is that most of the people who are executives in companies today are incentivized to be operators, right? To make EBIT, and they've got pressure mostly from not very strategic boards or management or whatever. Or they're part of corporates, and they're not operators. They're just incentivized to be operators. And it's very difficult to add cost to your P&L, say, to look at a problem through a design lens and invite some people. It's very costly to do that. It's very hard to do it. So this is partly why governance is so critical. So I was literally in a board yesterday that I'm a director of, and we set up a framework, and this is a very old school manufacturing company, but we set up a framework where we're purposely going to increase the aggregate labour percentage right across the company, but we've got identified in a database who is doing the building and who's doing the operating. Now the idea is that we drive the operations percentage down, but we at the cost of initially having a build budget. But if you do that, it's okay to increase expenditure on things provided you have a framework for return. So we have to build a framework for return within there. So we use methodologies like inventoring, where we have we borrowed Stanford Research Institute's kind of an innovation methodology, and then we apply funding in a sort of iterative framework, which if anyone emails me, I can share. And that framework allows us to invest and take risks within an operating framework, but within a way that we can provide governance to it and leave managers with the space to learn and grow. Now, if you don't do that, you've got no chance. Because, and that's why I want you to go and do design thinking courses, for example, because without that language and that experience, you just have no idea what you're doing. So, it's like go up the staircase. So if your staircase, the first step might be just learn about design thinking, learn about adventuring, explore the models, be curious, then figure out a way through. It's a staircase. But yes, this is the problem that I'm speaking into directly. Anyone else?
One more. Sina.
Yep.
Hi, Stefan. My name is Sina, and I'm with Leadership New Zealand. I'm curious about the power of automation, and what do human beings get to do in the organisations that grab the automation opportunity?
Yeah.
I'm sensing and I'm thinking, well, it makes our work a lot more creative and exciting, but I wonder what you see and what you have seen in companies.
I mean, 15 years ago, if you go back and get that perspective, you said, oh, gee, everything's getting automated, computers are really efficient, and, there's going to be a lot of unemployment, right? That seems obvious, but there's more employment than ever. And our living standards are better than ever, notwithstanding the media likes to say it's terrible, but we live in an age of more abundance than you could possibly imagine. But we have a growing services sector. So it's now not uncommon, for example, to get a massage. And I'm not saying we're all going to turn into massage therapists, but there are crazy industries, like we're going to have a massive industry expand in visual, 3D glasses, and that is going to engender a whole new world of entertainment and kind of virtual travel and a whole lot of things. So I think the economy, almost by design, when it's wealthy, is going to have full employment. It's just that the jobs are different. And my encouragement to young people today is to say, forget what the school tells you, in all honesty. More than ever, you need a very broad education that shows curiosity. You need to learn coding, music, art, physics. It's all coming together in a convergence, and it's those people that will own the future, not the lawyers and accountants.
Well, look,
Great.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for sort of tipping us out of our comfort zones for the morning and getting us thinking about the leading edge that we've got to be thinking on.